Today's lecture is on the rise and the nature of Atlantic slavery, slavery in the New World, and that's specifically black African slavery in the New World. Now, there's lots of different points in which you could start this lecture, but I like to start with a larger question, one that I think you always have to ask whenever you look at a topic like this in history, and that's why. And I mean specifically not the why and how it happened, because we'll get to that, but really, why is there slavery? Like, why is there slavery? We live in a world now where we condemn slavery, right? It still exists in some ways around the globe, and yet it's anathema, right, to our civilization now. But not in the 16th and 17th, 18th, or 19th centuries, truly. So let's ask why. In the grandest sense, and this is something we've discussed in other lectures, something I've brought up in other lectures, it is an unfortunate byproduct, this relationship, in almost every civilization, when the many people are compelled to work on behalf of the few, right? We've talked about this in the Morgan lecture, and I'm talking about it again, that oppression finds its way as institutionalized and an essential part of civilizations in which the many are compelled to work for the few, particularly when that work is odious and undesirable, right? That's when oppression really finds its way in. You know, I was preparing this lecture this morning, and I was reminded of a story I heard told by a Holocaust survivor who became a novelist, and he was talking about how years later he had traveled to Egypt, and when he first saw the Great Pyramid of Giza, he broke down in tears and started crying. Because as he gazed over what is celebrated as, you know, this monumental engineering work of human civilization, all he could see is the blood and the tears and the suffering in each and every giant brick that made the Great Pyramid of Giza. That for these ancient civilizations and civilizations up to fairly modern times, and this is especially prescient for a Holocaust survivor, that great achievement came at great labor cost. And those great labor costs have a story, have a human face of suffering by the tens, hundreds, millions. You know, and this is true, the Great Wall of China. Hundreds of thousands die in its construction. And it is still a foundational piece of human achievement. You can go across all of history, and not even just ancient world history. American history, 19th century American history, things that truly were a benefit, a feat of engineering. You know, we can look at the Transcontinental Railroad, but with each and every spike driven between Colorado and California across the Great Basin and through the Sierra Nevadas, right, is the tears, the suffering, and the death and the oppression of tens of thousands of Chinese and Irish immigrants working in either direction. It's the story of the Brooklyn Bridge, right? So part of slavery fits into this much grander narrative where great human civilizational achievement and work and effort and the creation of global economies and markets, all these sort of impressive engineering, social, cultural achievements are also built on an oppressive system of labor because the work to do to create these things was miserable, took time, took outrageous effort that not everybody wanted to do. The many are compelled to work for the few. And that's why slavery is part of human civilization across the globe in all times, in all places, up until very, very modern times. I mean, 7,000 years of human history sees the institutionalization of a certain level of oppression to create and achieve and build those civilizations in the first place. A little more specifically to New World slavery and the slavery that comes about, you know, in the period of time we're talking about. The early 16th century all the way through the 19th century. One of the things that will happen is, as I said, the nature of the work will be odious. There becomes a demand for almost, you know, long, 7-day-a-week work schedules, year-round labor needs. That intensifies during this period of time. Even more importantly is New World slavery expands and takes off during a period of time when we see the expansion of early capitalist global markets, right? The motives of profit and maximization of investment, right, are very much at the forefront of the rise of Atlantic world slavery. And these are very, very new motivational factors that help to expand it. And it's not just the profit and maximization of the plantation economies and the products they were putting out, although that's very much a part of it, but it's that the slave market itself, the extraction and transport and sale of slaves, becomes a major business in and of itself, becomes maybe the most global and one of the most profitable businesses. And so this real abstraction, this drive for profit, for maximization, really drives New World slavery and slavery in general to new heights. A couple other things that go in with New World slavery as to why. Why does it happen? Why is it allowed to continue? You know, most of slavery, the New World slavery, in relation to European societies at the time, happens in remote locations, right? The destinations of most slaves, as we'll talk about, are Brazil, are the West Indies, the Caribbean, right? And the southern colonies of North America, right? What becomes Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas. And these are remote. These are away from the everyday eyes and the detection of, you know, the comfortable middle classes and the rising urban classes of Europe, right? So when you add some of these factors together and then you put the need for profit maximization and efficiency, the sort of remoteness to it, it intensifies the nature of the slavery and intensifies the nature of oppression that'll be used to maintain this system. Another component of the puzzle, again, that cannot be removed in any way, is the otherness of the slaves themselves. The fact that the slaves are black African slaves. And as far as the Europeans are concerned, and actually as far as the very large Muslim Arab traders are concerned, which are the two major slave trades, they are others. They are outside of those civilizations' traditional understandings of rights, right? They are other races. They are neither Christian or Muslim. And so they can be oppressed to a far greater degree, right? Much far greater degree, more than you could oppress white indentured servants. Right? So that is part of it. So you have this otherness, remote location, drives of maximization, this absolute, huge labor demand to produce a product for which there was almost an insatiable demand for around the world, sugar and tobacco being at the forefront of that. These are the kind of societal, external reasons for why slavery not only was maintained and tolerated, but expanded and intensified and spread everywhere Europeans went from the old world across the new. There's another concept I want to throw into this, and it's a concept that comes from Karl Marx, and he got it from some other German theorist as well, but he's the one who really makes it famous. And I'm not going to go into a Marxist history here, but it's still it's an idea that makes sense, and it helps shed some light on this, on why people tolerated slavery and suffering for so long. And it's this idea of alienation. Alienation. When Marx in the 19th century is trying to understand why, his fellow middle class and upper middle class Englishmen, because he's German, he's living in England, tolerate the suffering in the factories of the working classes. And what he says is, the problem is alienation, that they don't see in the products they consume and the profits they make the human face of suffering. They just don't see it. They're too happy, too content with this product. But when they look at this product, they can't see that there is an institutionalized oppression that creates it. There's alienation. There's a division, right? A block that it's removed from its human context. Much like I was trying to make the point before about the pyramids and the Great Wall of China. There's a certain amount of alienation that you have to make a conscious choice to empathetically identify with the suffering and the human face that creates these. And, this is true for the growing world of slavery, for a great deal of Europe and much of the world, right? That the Europeans, the middle and upper middle class and wealthy Europeans, really couldn't see, in the sugar they stirred into their tea, and in the warmth, comfort they got from the tobacco they smoked. They couldn't see the tears of suffering of African slaves. They couldn't smell the filthy, human refuse-filled bilge water at the bottom of a Middle Passage slave ship. They didn't have that. They couldn't see it, they couldn't taste it, they couldn't smell it, right? They could just see these great products that they had that made their lives better, that made their economy stronger, that made their nations these powerful, growing nation states. So there's a point of alienation. It's not all alienation, because let's face it, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people had face-to-face contact with slavery. And the very worst and the most awful elements and the most human suffering part of slavery. And in spite of it, we see very few examples for hundreds of years of any sort of moral pause, of any sort of regret, of any sort of compassion, and more importantly, an idea that I'm going to come back to at the end of this lecture, empathy. True empathy for human suffering, that the drive for profits and maximization, even when face to face with the humans you're enacting this on, didn't lead to an empathetic response. And we need to think about why, because these are not just moral questions, right? They're not just ethical questions, they're historical questions. Things have changed over time, and we have to understand where it starts, what happened in the middle, and where it ends. Okay, we'll come back to that. Right now I want to do the larger history of Atlantic slavery. So the first question we want to ask is, where does slavery start? We'll take a look over here at the map. The first places that the Europeans will bring plantation slavery is right off the coast of Africa. Okay? Over here, the Spanish and the Portuguese, by the time Columbus is sailing to the New World, have already established a successful slave trade and successful sugar plantation economies, right? What they've done is the Spanish will, in the late 15th century, they'll have invaded and conquered the Canary Islands, Madeira, the Azores, and they will actually enslave. First, they'll enslave the indigenous people there. They'll die out, and then they will actually begin to import black African slaves to work on these islands and sugar plantations. The Spanish are actually the first ones to successfully plant sugar in an Atlantic world, right? It's not just in Asia. They make their own sugar plantations, and they're successful, right? They find out very early on that with bonded black African slave labor, okay, they are able to successfully grow and sell and market sugar. It's big money. The Portuguese are involved, and the main way the Portuguese are involved, they have sugar plantations as well, but they really become the middlemen. They are the middlemen for many products, but particularly for slaves early on. They will set up along different points along the West African coast these trading entrepôts, right? These large trading towns with which they do a couple of things. One, their ships sail and will keep pulling in and trading as they eventually work their way, the Portuguese being the first Europeans to really exploit and trade within the Indian Ocean world. But they will, get African products, gold, ivory, precious woods, jewels, and very early on, humans, right? Human slaves. And one of the first places they are transporting these human slaves is to these Spanish sugar islands. Right? So this trade already exists. And they will eventually, when they come to the New World, the Spanish along with looking for gold and silver, they will set up sugar plantations in the Mediterranean. And the Portuguese will set up one of the largest and most successful sugar colonies here in Brazil. And fairly early on, these will be, by 1600, exclusively worked by black African slaves. Okay? Brazil, the West Indies, the sugar plantations there are almost 100% black African slaves for the Portuguese and the Spanish. They do, for a period of time, also use Indian slaves, right? They do enslave the Native Americans that are there, a couple things happen. One, the Catholic Church actually steps in on this, and in the 1540s declares that if any of the Native Americans who convert to Catholicism cannot be enslaved. They acknowledge their humanity, and they give them rights as Catholic Christians. And the Spanish and the Portuguese were already turning towards black African slavery. They already had established black African slavery and the slave trade. So it wasn't as big a deal for them to give it up. And the only place where they don't give it up is over here at the Potosi silver mines. When the Spanish conquer that, and this is an aside, but the Potosi silver mines are at 13,000 feet. And because of the altitude, this is, again, a story of climate and geography, right? Because of the altitude, neither European workers nor African workers survived very long. They couldn't work hard at that altitude. And what they did instead is they did use the indigenous people, the Native Americans of that area, as bonded labor to mine the Potosi silver mines. And they would for hundreds of years. Millions of them would work and die there over hundreds of years. In fact, it's probably the one major time that the Spaniards will choose gold over God in choosing what laborers they want to use. But that's a function of geography and is somewhat of an exceptional case. After the 1540s, the black African slave trade is booming, and it determines the plantation economies of these areas. I want to make one other quick point because it's an interesting point, I think. So we know, the Spaniards and the Portuguese control these islands, and the Portuguese would have these trading posts here on the coast of Africa. And in fact, other people would later too. The British Royal African Company would also set these up in the 17th century, right? They wouldn't be the only one. What's interesting is, do you realize that this is the limit of European penetration into sub-Saharan Africa until 1880, really until the 1880s? So we go from 1500, earlier than 1500 really, but say roughly 1500 to 1880s, 380 years, where the Europeans cannot get much further in than this. And the question is why? The Europeans conquer and dominate, invade the entire rest of the world. Africa is really the last place to get fully colonized. And it happens really quickly when it does happen. 1880 to 1890 is the African scramble, where they go from holding Europeans have less than 10% of the control of Africa to they get about 90%. 10-year period. And the reason why is this. It's a couple of curious things. One, the African states themselves on the interior, the Dahomey, the Asante, are actually quite strong. They are well disciplined, they are large, they are populous, they trade for good weaponry early on with the Europeans. They're actually fairly able to resist European incursion, right? The Europeans deal with them, I can't say as equals, but in far less of extreme differentiation of power, right? They deal with them more fairly, and they're more interested in trade. Bigger reason than that, though, and anyone who's ever gone to Africa knows this. You know what you have to do if you want to go to Africa? You have to get a bunch of shots, right? It used to be like 20, and I think they've gotten them down to about 6. But you need inoculations and immunizations to go to Africa. It's disease. The Europeans cannot handle African tropical diseases. In the same way that the Native Americans didn't have very strong antibodies and immunities to old world diseases, especially in a tropical, hotter climate, Europeans had the same problem. The Royal African Company, the people who work at these posts, the death rate for them is 9 out of 10. 9 out of 10 people who work there will die. And that's just living along the coast. So, and we're going to come back to this idea of disease resistance because it is important to the story of slavery. But two things, the strength of the African states themselves and the nature of disease. It took a miracle of modern science, modern medical science, to enable the European conquest of Africa's interior. Just something I wanted to share. So coming back to this, so that's the world before the English get involved. The English and the Dutch, they're the 17th century, they get involved in and expand African slavery and slave-based plantation economies in the New World. They have the exact same labor demands as the Spanish and the Portuguese. And, they will ultimately set up You know, they will have sugar plantations here in the Caribbean, particularly on Barbados and Cuba. They will also, you know, get involved in tobacco plantations, as we know, around the Chesapeake, in Virginia and Maryland and Northern Carolina, the Tidewater area. And further south, the main plantation economies, it won't be cotton, that's actually quite a bit later, it'll be rice. And rice turns out to be one of the most profitable mainland cash crops, if not the most profitable mainland cash crop for the colonial era. And they also grow indigo. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. From the very beginning, you know, the English and the Dutch had no qualms, no religious restrictions on using any race, white, Native American, African, using any race as bonded labor. And in fact, they will try all of them, right? They will start out with, in the Caribbean, when they first set up, and these start out as tobacco plantations in the Caribbean, they will, and then they move to sugar plantations. And we know in Virginia, they'll use white indentured servants, poor, young, urban dwelling, mostly men and some women from England, right? That's who they will use as their bonded labor. You know, in the Caribbean, this dies out a lot quicker than it does in Virginia. Part of the reason is biological. Again, you know, the white indentured servants from England, because they are mixing in both with African slaves, and they're in a hot, sunny, I mean brutally sunny and hot tropical environment, they drop like flies. They really just cannot survive it. Their death rate is almost as high as the Native Americans who are working alongside of them. So one is the disease is a problem. That helps work against the increase of indentured servants in these areas. The other problem is there's competition for these indentured servants. You know, most of them choose to go to Virginia and the Chesapeake because even though we know the story is brutal there was a better promise of land, a higher rate of survivability, if you could believe that, and it was a better climate, and they knew this. So most of the indentured servants who were making a choice one way or another to go to the Caribbean or to go to Virginia or Maryland chose the Chesapeake. And so, you know, by the middle of the 17th century, indentured servitude, white indentured servitude, is no longer the preferred form of bonded labor in the Caribbean. And by the 1670s, there's an overwhelming shift towards black African slavery in the Chesapeake and in the Carolinas as well. You know, another big question we always have to ask, because how does slavery become what it is? Specifically black African slavery. And the question is, why not Indian slavery? Why not more Native American slavery, right? Because the Native Americans, listen, they are another race just as easy to oppress, actually probably easier to oppress than the Africans. They're closer, they are cheaper, they're right there. Why don't they use Native American slave labor in such large amounts, right? Why is there this preference for black African slaves? There's a couple answers to that question. First of all, they did use indigenous people as slaves, right? Whenever any of these initial plantations were set up by English, Dutch, Spanish, the first people they enslave are the indigenous people living on those islands or those areas. The problem is they died off so quickly, you know, because they did mix in African slaves as well and Europeans, and the diseases and the brutality of the system just led to a very, very high death rate, mortality rate of Native American slaves. You know, I should say though, but they still had, after that period of time, there is a thriving slave trade in the Americas. You know, here in the Carolinas, you know, English slave traders will actually work with the Yamasee Indians and the Creek Indians, right? They pay them basically to go and raid other southeastern Indian civilizations, capture slaves that they bring back to Charleston, which were then sold into the slave markets down in the West Indies, right? They did have a slave market. And tens of thousands of Native Americans are sold into slavery by that very method, right? So that you have the Creek and the Yamasee acting as slave catchers and then selling them to white traders in Charleston, transportation into slavery and death in the West Indies. Also, any wars fought in the colonial period between white settlers and Native Americans usually resulted at the end with the sale of the captive Native Americans into slavery. However, the preference for black African slaves in the West Indies from the 17th century on, and in the Carolinas and the Chesapeake after 1700 was pretty much absolute. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One, in spite of the fact that there were Native Americans close by, right, that you could capture them, there already is a well-established market system with the European powers and powerful black African kingdoms conspiring together to efficiently and brutally extract, transport, and sell, and then disperse millions of black Africans throughout the Atlantic world, right? And they were more than able to meet very efficiently the growing demand and need for labor. They could do it more efficiently and faster than anyone else. So part of it is that because of the Portuguese and the Spanish, what they had set up, there was just this really well-oiled market machine based on the brutal extraction of humans from this area of West Africa across the Atlantic and quickly dispersed, right? So the system is there. It was easy to tap into it. And it was actually easy for both the Dutch and English to tap into it as traders and transporters themselves, to profit on this as well. Another reason has to do, like we said before, of course, is the race, the otherness of the Africans themselves, right? They are not Christians, they are not white Englishmen or white Dutchmen. They don't have the traditional rights and protections legally or institutionally of those civilizations that they would give to their own people. And therefore, the amount of oppression you can place upon them, the permanent status of bondage from birth to death can be implemented on them, and you could use all of the coercion necessary to force them to accept their condition. And a final thing, and again, it comes back to something that was a strength of the Africans, right? We talked about how the Europeans for almost 400 years really couldn't conquer or impose themselves on the interior of Africa, on those strong African states, because of disease, because of the strong constitutions, frankly, of the Africans themselves to tropical diseases and life in a hot tropical climate. Well, that also is part of what made them highly desirable as slaves. They survived longer on sugar plantations in the hot tropical Caribbean, Brazil, and the Carolinas than white indentured servants, and certainly more than Native American slaves. It's an unfortunate fact and reality. This was observed very early on, and it is part of the story. So there's a certain amount of survivability in brutally hot and resistance to disease climates, right? The otherness of blackness of the Africans, and that well-established, well-greased, highly efficient, highly profitable slave trade already existing, all conspired together to make black African slavery the preferred form, the only form by the 1700s, of bonded plantation labor in the New World. Between 1492 and 1770, far more Africans come to the New World than Europeans, right? The overwhelming nature of New World immigration, even though it's forced immigration, but of New World immigration is black African, right? Sub-Saharan African, overwhelmingly. Roughly they think, and the numbers go, because we don't have hard and fast numbers, right? But somewhere between 10 and 14 million Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, are taken from West Africa, loaded on slave ships, and sailed to the New World, somewhere 10 to 14 million. Most of them, to the tune of well over 90% of them, will go to Brazil, and you can see that represented. The fatter the lines, the more slaves that came this direction will come to Brazil, the sugar plantations in Brazil, and the West Indies. Somewhere between 5 and 8% of all slaves brought to the New World actually go to the areas that will become the United States of America, right? The continental U.S. really only receives about 5% of slaves. I think at most they say about, by the time of the Revolution, maybe 250,000 slaves had been brought to America, to this part of America. One of the big effects of the trade is the impacts it has on Africa. You know, contrary to some popular beliefs, the one thing it doesn't do as far as West Africa is concerned, and this is different from the East African slave trade, but in West Africa, it doesn't cause a major population collapse. Now that seems odd considering the tens of millions of people over a 300-year period, or almost a 400-year period, who were taken out. But here are the sort of biological and cultural facts on the ground. We know that the populations stayed relatively stable in these areas in terms of numbers. And it's because of this. The West African slave trade, the Atlantic world slave trade, overwhelmingly preferred and demanded male slaves, young male slaves. They wanted them only for labor, right? That's the only reason they're being brought over at all, is hard labor on sugar, tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations, okay, and mining. That's why they're coming over. And the mentality of the time was, we only want strong, young male slaves who will survive a long time, will handle the work. That's the brutality of it. The reason why this doesn't cause a population collapse is cultural and biological. West African states practice polygamy. And the rate a population grows for any mammal, for any sexually reproducing organism, is not determined, right, by the number of men or males within that community or civilization. It's determined by the number of fertile females. The rough biological math is that one fertile male and 10 fertile females, that population will grow at a far faster rate than one with 100 fertile males and 2 fertile females, right? That's just because of how many children you could have in the course of a year. So the brutal reality of it is that the biology determined, and culture, because they did practice polygamy, allowed the populations to stay stable. Another big effect it had was it actually created some very far-reaching, well-organized, and growingly wealthy African states on the interior. You know, particularly are the Dahomey and the Asante. Both rise up to great power and will remain in great power for a long period of time. And as I said, they become more than just suppliers of the raw material of the slave trade, right? They grow in wealth enough that they become major purchasers of European manufactured goods and of raw materials coming from the New World, right? They become an important part of the triangular trade. That, you know, there's a demand for building and stuff here. There's raw materials that come, that they will get. They love fabric and colored textiles, particularly cotton, coming out of London. They buy guns and weaponry. You know, the markets, the sale of manufactured goods from Europe and raw materials from the New World in Africa, those markets ultimately are almost as economically important and as profitable as the slave trade itself, right? So that actually becomes a pretty important shift. That's the way Africa changes. In fact, one historian refers to it as the great irony of Christopher Columbus, right? Because what did Columbus want to do? When he went to the New World and even introduced slavery into the New World, right? He was only looking to tap into the old world economy, right? The source of wealth, the dynamic economy that the Europeans were trying to get control of when they did things like explore and settle areas like Columbus, right? Is this world, the Indian Ocean world, the trade with China, and the wealth of the Mediterranean. All of this. However, the irony is, in discovering a new world, populating it with slave economies, right, and all that that created, it made a huge shift that the new global dynamic economy, the one that grew for the next 300 years, the real source of wealth, was here. It's in the West. It basically leaves the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean world behind, and that this triangular trade becomes the future of Europe, and the future of the New World, and the future of Africa. In fact, the future of now, right? This, for a long period of time, conditions the rise of Europe. It was sort of the unforeseen consequence. They were looking to exploit and be more involved in the economies here, and in doing so, they created this economy here. And this is the economy in which the colonial America and United States of America rises here. So who is actually the main people controlling the slave trade? You know, various nation states, the Dutch, the English, the French, the Spanish and the Portuguese will fight with one another to gain control of particular trading posts in Africa and along the way to control the trade in the Atlantic world and in the Caribbean. They will, the Caribbean itself is actually a very unstable civilization for many reasons, weather not being the least of them. But there's a lot of invasion. These islands are constantly changing hands, right? Because they were easy to invade. If you had a navy, it was hard to defend your island, So that's part of it. Specifically, though, early on, the British will use chartered corporations to control the slave trade, right? So the Dutch do the same thing. They give official monopolies to chartered corporations. For the British, they use the Royal African Company, and they will control the slave trade for most of the 16th century as far as England is concerned. They set up trading posts along the coast of Africa, similar to the Portuguese, and they will transport almost all of their slaves to Barbados, and from Barbados, right, then you sell them again, and that's how slaves would get to different islands, right, but they came into the Caribbean. Alongside of that, what we see happening, though, is this sort of new world, risk-taking entrepreneurialism. And even though it's a dark and brutal market in which to be an entrepreneur, great profits could be made by daring sailors who were willing to go over from the colonies, sail to Africa, set up their own trading relationships, and transport slaves back because the demand is so high. And a lot of these small entrepreneurs, basically, at first they're smugglers, and eventually in the early 1700s, the official monopoly of the Royal African Company is lifted. But they actually become the main way slaves are brought into the New World after 1700. It's done by small entrepreneurs. Guys with a small number of ships willing to take risks to set up their own slave trade. And it's a perilous journey. I mean, there's a lot that can go on and go wrong. But if you could get your slaves back, the profits were enormous. And so these small entrepreneurs made outrageous amounts of money. Again, it's what I like to call the attention to of the slave trade. What makes the Atlantic slave trade so great, so expansive, right, wasn't just the profits of the slave labor, right, the profits of sugar and tobacco and rice, although that is incredibly important. It's the incredible profits made on the transport and sale of slaves themselves, that effort to maximize at any cost the seizure and transport and delivery of black Africans. The Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is what we refer to, and you've probably heard this concept before, but it's the passage. There's a point in time where these powerful African states raid, invade, make war on weaker African states and seize slaves, okay? And these slaves are then marched and transported, right, to these coastal trading posts that are controlled by the Europeans, from which they are then loaded on the boats and they move along. They might stop at Cape Verde for extra stuff, but then the Middle Passage is this passage across the Atlantic. And, accounts of the time would say that you could smell a slave ship a day before it arrived. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. They had hundreds, sometimes thousands of men chained body to body at the bottom of a boat where bilge and human refuse and offal is just piling up. And death and decay is all around. The death rate among the African slaves is 10 to 15%, right? Mostly from disease, obviously also from abuse, from starvation, some of them also from despair and suicide if they could. I mean, this is the true belly of the beast, the darkest part of a very dark history and a very dark economy is in the belly of that boat. And, this bilge water, this smell of death and decay stayed with that boat. I mean, it's the smell of human suffering, I'm sure, wafted across the waves well before it reached any port to unload. And it's also important to note that the death and the suffering was not just experienced by the African slaves themselves, although theirs was certainly the worst because of the way they were being held and the uncertainty of their future and the fear that is induced because they didn't know what was happening. But the sailors, those who worked on the boats, suffered a death rate of close to 15 to 20%. The whites who were involved in the slave trade, and this is where the darkness of the slave trade is almost unimaginable. This is that idea of alienation again. How could profits be so driving? 1 in 5 sailors, they say, who worked on a Middle Passage ship died, mostly from disease, right? That's from disease, that encountering African diseases, poor nutrition on the high seas, tropical weather, and of course the precariousness of sailing wooden boats across the Atlantic. As I told you, the Royal African Company in their trading post in Africa were suffering a death rate of 90%. That's the white traders. The entire slave trade smelled and reeked of death and despair, from one end to the other, from the white slave trader to the miserable condition of the chained slave in the hull of a boat. There's no getting around that. It's wrapping our brains historically across such a situation is akin to trying to understand what the liberators saw when they first walked into the death camps of Dachau and Treblinka, right? It's that kind of suffering, and yet it just kept going on. It was driven for 300 years, this goes on. And the Middle Passage, as I said, if you survived it, that is the worst part of slavery. That is the darkest moment for all involved. Talk a little bit now specifically about slavery in America, right? Where does it happen? We already know, and I've said this a couple times, you know, the vast majority of slaves, well over 90%, are going to Brazil and the West Indies. In America, well, we have the Chesapeake region, Chesapeake Bay over here. We know this is where the Virginia and Maryland and the northern part of North Carolina, which is called Carolina at the time, it's called the Tidewater area. So we know they will all use indentured servants through the first 2/3 of the 17th century, white indentured servants, to grow tobacco. After Bacon's Rebellion, they make a big lurch towards black African slavery, that by 1700, not only are most of the laborers in this area black Africans, close to 20% of all the people living in the Chesapeake are black African slaves. 20%. I mean, that's a, you know, there were black Africans in the Chesapeake prior to this point in time. And in fact, their status was somewhat uncertain. Some were slaves. Apparently, some were free. Some had been used as indentured servants. You know, it hadn't really been a hardened identity that African meant slave prior to the 1650s, 1660s. But the wholesale decision to begin to import black African slaves to replace white indentured servants, and a second thing that happens starting in the 1670s is from the West Indies, sugar became all important. But there were a lot of tobacco plantation owners there who had slaves, who had been working with slaves for 20, 30, and 40 years, English plantation owners. And the sugar plantation owners are more profitable and more powerful. They push them out. And so these guys were taking wholesale their plantations and their labor and bringing them to the Chesapeake. In fact, early on, almost all of the black African slaves in the Chesapeake had already been slaves in the West Indies. And as we have this sort of influx of West Indian black African slavery, they bring in a hardening of the slave codes, that they make laws that restrict slave movement, that define Africans as slaves, that spell out specifically the extremity of the punishments you can use to oppress your slaves. And we see the rise of something I kind of call the surveillance society, as you have this ever-growing mass of black African slaves, an alien people in your midst, right? And they don't want to be slaves. This is the most important part of the slave system, and I want to come back to this. This is why oppression is so institutionalized in the slave system. Black Africans, nobody wants to be a slave. None of them, I want to repeat this, none of them are complicit in their slavery. None of them accept slavery, right? It has to be forced on them. It has to be constantly forced on them to compel them to be slaves. And institutions creep up in the Chesapeake Society and then in the Carolinas later, right, that enshrine this oppression and pretty much define, after 1700, basically every black African in those areas is a slave. The next area I want to talk about, and this is really interesting area, is South Carolina. You know, just so we know where we're talking about, that's here, right? So this would be what becomes North Carolina, and this is the Tidewater area. But as you come down here in South Carolina, you know, the coastal area here is actually a long series of saltwater flats and swamps, right? It's hard to navigate, hard to farm, hard to survive on. It is incredibly tropical and hot, humid, right? It wasn't suitable for tobacco growing. And, you know, starting around 1660s, we will get white settlement there who were looking to do something profitable. They try to establish all types of plantations, earlier tobacco, and they fail, but they bring black African slaves with them. And what's really interesting is, because there's no plantation economy right away, and there are a large number of black African slaves. By 1680, 1690, 1/3 of the people in South Carolina, and it's all along the coast, right, will be black African slaves. They do an interesting job of sort of recreating African civilization in the New World. I mean, it is said that South Carolina, particularly that area of coastal South Carolina, will be the most Africanized region of the New World during this period of time. You know, one of the things that'll happen is the African slaves will kind of go about their own traditional economy, and it'll be of a great benefit. Like, for instance, they carve out a specific type of canoe that's very good at navigating the swampy waterways of coastal Carolina, because it's very, very similar to the coastal areas of West Africa from where they are from. And they make a special type of net that are really, really great at fishing in that area. And they're able to supply enough fish not only to feed the people there, but to an early fishing market in Charleston. In addition to that, they're very good at capturing crocodiles or alligators here and tanning their hides, turning their skins into a useful leather. Again, it was something they were already doing in their homelands in West Africa. They bring that skill with them here. You know, a lot of them were also very good at raising and tending cattle, and again, working with cattle hide, turning it into leather. This is a long-standing traditional African craft and economy. And again, early on in South Carolina, they do have cattle herds. They're overwhelmingly tended by African slaves who are very good at turning skins into usable leathers for market sale. As a matter of fact, it's this African community there that allows for the survival of the South Carolina area of this colony for the first 30 years, right? It makes it remotely viable. They also introduce something else that will actually make it incredibly profitable, and that's rice cultivation. Now, I want to tell you that there is some controversy on how much the African slaves there were responsible for introducing rice cultivation. But the facts are this, that well over 45% of the slaves in that area are from the rice-growing regions of the Gambia, and the style of rice growing that is planted there is very similar in terms of technique and growing season as the African style. And it wasn't happening anywhere else in the New World prior to the concentration of these slaves, right? And so it's led some historians to argue that the African slaves themselves introduced this. And as it turns out, rice is like a super grain, right? We know this. Rice has, it can grow in this particular environment really well. This is the exact nature of what a rice paddy is, this perennially flooding saltwater swamps, and the heat in the tropics that allow it to grow. But what's great about rice is its sort of calorie to weight ratio can't be beat in the natural world. And not only that, when you dry rice out, it is incredibly resistant to rot. We know that. I can keep a box of rice in my cupboard for 3 years before it goes bad, if it ever goes bad. And so it's very easy to transport, and there's always a demand for high-calorie foods across all the world, especially in Europe, where populations are booming. And rice will quickly become the plantation economy of South Carolina. And as a matter of fact, it becomes far more than tobacco, the most profitable plantation economy in the continental United States, what becomes the continental United States. The rice plantation owners become the real top dog, wealthiest members of this colonial society. And again, they will start from the very, very beginning exclusively using black African slaves. Another thing that gets invented or brought in 1740 to South Carolina is indigo. And indigo is a plant from which you can make this blue dye blue and purple dyes, indigo. And it's highly sought after for, dyeing clothes and cloths, making bright colors. And they're able to grow it. Eliza Lucas, who is the daughter of a West Indian planter who moves to Carolina to grow rice. And in the 1740s, she, working with African slaves, actually comes up with a way to cultivate indigo in South Carolina. And it turns out to be the great, perfect complementary crop, because whereas rice is grown in the wet lowlands, the higher lands is where you would grow indigo. And it had opposite growing seasons from rice, right? It grew during winter seasons as opposed to the summer seasons. And so it enabled year-round profitability from a plantation economy dipping into these expanding global markets in South Carolina. All slave-driven, all relying on slave labor. And again, these are these curious moments where we look at European history, and you could see it's an era of high-minded ingenuity, right? And where women are coming up with, invention and progress, right? And yet, side by side stands the absolute worst and most oppressive holdover from pre-modern times, slavery. In fact, slavery and this ingenuity go hand in hand, right? It's that American paradox, and we could call it the New World paradox, again, coming back to haunt us in our early history. Another thing I want to point out about South Carolina and American slavery in general is there's something unique to American slavery. And that is, American slavery was the one place we find a large number of female Africans, right? And part of the reason for that is the tobacco plantations and the early efforts in South Carolina, the planters there, they didn't have a lot of money. They can't really outbid the West Indian and the Brazilian, right, plantation owners, the sugar plantation owners, for strong, young male slaves. They actually buy a certain amount of young, strong female slaves to supplement their slave workforce. There's a couple of unintended results from this. And one of them, well, first of all, what we see is the most important result of this is something that we first see in America, and it becomes, in fact, I think, the defining face of continental American slavery, and that is the slave family. A family of slaves with a father and a mother and children, all bonded permanently for life as a particular and peculiar, as they would call it, institution in the world of slavery in the New World. The rise of the slave family. The dark side of this, of course, is this area of North America becomes one of the few places in the whole world where the population of slaves is self-sustaining, right? That, by the middle of the 18th century, slave growth in the continental United States comes from natural increase. The children of people already slaves, far more than the importation of slaves. It's the only place that does that. And that is a true dark side, right? That slavery is now being perpetuated from parents to child transgenerationally, right? And it creates a unique set of laws, truly unique to what will become the United States of America. On the other hand, you have to look that in spite of the fact that less than 8% of all African slaves, that less of them came to mainland America, right? 92% of them going somewhere else. America, to this day, has the largest number of people of African descent, right, of anywhere outside of Africa itself, right? The largest number, not the largest percentage. There are New World civilizations with a higher percentage, but in sheer numbers, America has the most, right? And this is the very essence and the strength of American diversity and American culture, right? Our multiracial identity is a product of the slave family, is a product of a purely economic decision on the behalf of these early slaveholders. And in spite of its dark history, in spite of the real terrible nature of this view of slave families and a slave holding that self-perpetuates, the long history of it also, that goes side by side of that, is it is the cause of American diversity. And as I would say, you know, American diversity, actually I should say, has two causes. If we look at modern times, there are two fundamental causes of what we recognize as Americans' pluralistic society. And actually the one I have to say is, from the very beginning of colonization up until very modern times, the global nature of immigration to America, obviously, of willing immigration to America, is one of the foundational points of American diversity. But the other is the slave family itself. And the history of the slave family in America is why America is diverse. Just sort of a final point on South Carolina I wanted to put out there. You know, as I said, it becomes the most Africanized. You know, by 1750, it is over 50% black African. Most of the people who live in South Carolina will be African or of African descent. And as several historians have noted it's the one place at the time of the Revolution where there's in fact a black majority, all right, in that colony. They even have, and you know, that African culture survives. You know, there's a language, Gullah, right? And Gullah is a combination of West African tongues and English that merges together along the coastal areas of South Carolina. It's still spoken today in certain remote areas. Slavery in the North. You know, the soils of the North did not lend themselves to mass-produced cash crops. They tried. It didn't really work. And what really did work well was sort of mixed product family farming, right? That's the main agricultural produce. And even though they were market-focused from New England down to Pennsylvania, right, they didn't need a huge mass of labor. Most people had enough labor within their own family. They had large families, and you might hire a few seasonal workers, and that was usually enough labor to bring everything you could grow to market successfully, right, and assure the sort of rising middling class lifestyle, right? Most of the slavery we see in the North, and it'll be far, far, far less in the South. You know, the South, the Chesapeake, Maryland, down south, and this will remain true until after the Civil War, remains fundamentally committed to slavery as a primary economic and social institution of those regions. The North, not so much. They will have slavery, all right, and most of them will have slavery up to the Revolution. However, it's not the defining aspect of the North, and part of it is that agricultural reason. Most of the slaves we'll see will be in city areas, urbanized areas. The number one use is as domestic help, right, people attached to wealthy households. We will also see slaves attached to businesses, you know, certain craftsman shops, particularly if the slaves have some skill themselves. You might have a permanently bonded labor attached to the shop, to a carpenter shop or a blacksmith shop, right, in the cities as an additional worker. There won't be lots of them, but maybe one or two. You would see slaves attached as domestic workers to inns and taverns. You will also see, the one place you'll see larger use of slaves is in a couple of key industries and a couple of key locations. And again, this has to do with the skills that Africans brought with them. I want to kind of reintroduce a point that I meant to say before. I don't want anyone listening to this lecture to think of Africans who come here as a blank slate, right? They weren't just a working body that suffered. And that was true, but they came with skills, with ideas, with abilities. West African society is a diverse society of highly layered economic and craftsmanship skills. And many of these slaves had these skills with them. They could cultivate rice and fish. They could make nets. They could, you know, tan leathers. And another thing that they could do was work with iron. Iron working is quite old in Africa, and it is quite a skill. And in Jersey, in New Jersey, in Elizabethtown, and in West Jersey, there were several of these iron foundries which were run almost entirely on slave labor, where several hundred slaves were bonded to these early proto-manufacturer of iron. And you see that in a couple of other places. So, and part of the reason is because there were slaves from West Africa who had iron-working skills, right? They actually were desired for that reason. The couple of places where we see a high concentration of slaves are in Newport, Rhode Island, and New York City. Each of them probably had a black African population of around 10%. And over the course of the 18th century, we'll see a slow rise of a free black population in northern cities. And the reason for this is a couple of fold. One has to do with the First Great Awakening, but I don't want to talk about today. Before that, you know, slaves in cities often had more time to themselves, and they had some abilities for free association. There are actually slave taverns they could go to. And what they also could do is when you were done with your work, if you worked in a shop or you were a domestic, right, you could rent out your labor to somebody else, to another shop, to another person who needed help. You would give a cut to your owner, of course, right? But over time, you could accumulate enough money to buy your freedom. And as I said, you know, no slave is complicit in their slavery. All slaves wanted to be something else other than slaves. That is a fact of human nature. And this is one of the great strategies, successful strategies in making that a reality. And so we do see there is a mixing in the cities of that African by the middle of the 18th century didn't necessarily mean slave, unlike in the South, right? In the South, you know, the color you wore on your countenance decried your status within that civilization, that society. In the North, that does begin to change. There are cracks in the edifice of the slave-African bond. I want to go over a couple of commonalities experienced by all slaves in all civilizations, right, in the New World, but particularly in what becomes the continental U.S. First of all of them, whether they're domestics in a city or working in a craftsman or working on a rice plantation, no matter where they were, oppression by the white owners and a white society around them that sustained this institution, oppression in all different forms, is the fundamental fact of their life. This system cannot work without the constant and steady institutionalized application of oppression. The many will work for the few only when they're oppressed, especially when the work is odious. That is my fundamental fact of early America that I'm trying to get across to you, and maybe for all of past civilizations. Oppression is a major part of the system. And oppression came in many, many different ways. Obviously, physical torture and punishments, whippings and brandings, and you know, we know that aspect of slavery. Another one is, you know, access to food. You know, food was tough for the slave to get, right? And a lot of masters would use food and starvation as a way to control their slaves. This is very common. Maybe one of the darkest and most awful ways that they used to control and oppress slaveries was to take advantage of that very unique continental U.S. institution, the slave family. You know, and I know we can all identify with this. Anybody listening to this lecture understands. The threats that are not implied to you are one thing, but the threats that are implied to your wife or your children that you could do nothing about, the threat that your child would be sold away and you'd never see them again, or your husband or your wife, there is no more powerful or cruel or effective form of oppression you could possibly apply. And from the moment slave families became the reality of American New World slavery, the threat and the actual application of manipulating and harming the slave family itself became a #1 way of oppressing and controlling the slaves. You know, it's one of the great questions. You know, we will see this again and again in Brazil and the West Indies. There are a lot of slave uprisings. It is a constant fact that military has to constantly come in and crush slave uprisings in Brazil and the West Indies, right? You have this large, large mass of young male slaves with no other attachments. And if they worked in sugar plantations, they had access to machetes, right? And this is ultimately, Haiti is a successful slave plantation, uprising that, you know, forms the first, you know, free black civilization in the New World. We don't see a lot of uprisings. There are a couple, and we can name them, right? We don't see a lot of larger armed or any kind of uprisings on the continental U.S. We have the Stoner Rebellion, Nat Turner's Rebellion, Gabriel Prosser, but that's really it. And none of them are really that large. We're talking 30 to 100 people. And I believe, this is my point, it's the nature of the slave family itself worked against it. the risk was too great. The risk to a young man who lives under oppression with nothing to lose is not that great, and we're not surprised to see uprisings. But the risk to the person with children, or who is a child, or a mother, and a husband, it's too great. And it is the way they controlled it. It's why slave uprising, I believe, is mitigated for almost the entirety, right, of slavery in America. Another thing that they all experienced was surveillance, and this kind of goes with the oppression. White people and white English society became obsessed with looking and keeping an eye on black society. As I said, in some places they're a majority. Across all the colonies, they're 20% of the people. And they are oppressed, and they are bonded, and they don't want to be oppressed or bonded. And a whole set of laws come about that watch slaves, know where they are, curfews, punishments, right? And that people saw they had a responsibility to catch and check and be aware of where black people were. The Native Americans who surround slave societies, right, on the periphery, they become part of this surveillance. They are the #1 slave catchers of escaped slaves. They bring them back. And the problem was, for the African slave, he couldn't hide. He had to hide in plain sight. In the South in particular, in the city was one thing, but in the South in particular, his race gave him away, right? His condition was spelled out on his face. So this surveillance society, Native Americans, white society, really, one of the ways that African slaves suffer is they're constantly being watched. And that is the last great commonality is they all struggle to carve out their own personal space. And some can do it. Those on larger plantations, and certainly into the 19th century, could almost carve out whole villages on the plantation away from white eyes, where they could have their families, they could have rituals, they could have their own culture could grow. In the cities, there were opportunities for free association in in taverns and in certain public spaces, in certain homes. There were places for Africans, free and slave, to be away from surveillance for just a little bit, to have their culture. The ones who probably suffered the most are slaves, and this is certainly true in the 19th century, on small holdings. The small farmer who owns 2 or 3 slaves, or the domestic who has to live with the white family. They could have no place of grace. No place of grace. They were never, even if their lives were better off in terms of food access or something, the fact that they could never be out of the eye of the oppressive master society is in many ways the greatest suffering of all, right? And those are the ones who had the hardest time of carving out. Yet, I'm sure they still struggled to find it, in some way found some solace. But that no place of grace is what they faced. I want to finish up with one final larger historical idea. We have to, when I look at the history of Atlantic world slavery, and if I look at the history of Arab world slavery, in which 20 million people are sold into slavery, mostly women and children, as a matter of fact, and if I look at the conquest of the New World and Indian removal and, further back in time, the expansion of the Mongols, all these different things that happen again and again and again in history. And in many ways, the callousness, the lack of moral pause, a reserve or questioning of those involved, I can't help but be struck by the lack of empathy. And it has made me start to think, and my historical interjection into this story is that American history, modern history, is also a story of the rise of empathy. That somehow we go from a world where people can work on a Middle Passage slave ship more than once and be involved in that trade and keep doing it. We have a world that is both, it's not just the alienation, it's that empathy. It seems to be lacking in that world. It wasn't a desired goal. And empathy is this, in case you know, it is that ability to have compassion and identity with others, to see their sufferings, their lives, their needs, not just something that makes you feel sad, but something that is the same as you, that you identify with. You see yourself in them, and you are compelled to action. That is the other part of empathy. You do something about it. You at least can't participate in it, right, their suffering. That's empathy. And the world of the 16th, 17th, 18th century was lacking in empathy, not just in terms of the slave trade or mass genocides. People tortured animals for recreation. popular recreation, right? I mean, this is a world that had no empathy. Here in the 21st century, in spite of many, many of our faults, I have to say that the historical project of empathy has taken a grand leap forward. I've seen evidence of it in my own lifetime as we address things like bullying in a much more direct way. There's that ever-expansion idea. And my argument about empathy is that's a result of history. That some historical processes that I believe were actually already in place by the 16th and 17th century have grown and have happened to us that produced the modern world where we are far more empathetic, where when we hear about slavery or we hear about any sort of human degradation, most of us will, one, not only feel bad about it, but we'll be involved. We'll change our behaviors. We'll demand our government create some sort of institution to contend with it, right? We have all sorts of trade relationships, the way we treat labor, the way we treat, the way we've broadened our views of race. I mean, our empathy as our highest goal, when we're doing it at our best, is transracial. It's transspecial. I was talking about how dogs were suffering in the past. You know, we protect endangered species and have rescue dog societies and make animals part of our family. That's a huge swap and change in historical empathy. And we live in that time. And all I really want to get to is to say that as you look across the landscape of history and you apply historical analysis, we look at what came before. I would like you to try to identify what historically happened, what changed human civilization, right? Empathy is an unfinished project, I should say, and I believe it needs to be expanded further, right, across the globe, across our own society, but it's certainly, I believe, I feel comfortable enough saying that in contemporary first world society, empathy is a worthy goal, recognized as a worthy goal. You will never take an academic class where empathy and appreciation for others is not a fundamental part of that class, right? You will never take a history class that doesn't go over suffering of those in the past, the wrongness of it, the way we've corrected it, right? So empathy is part of who we are. And what I want you to do is you look at what happens in the past, and who knows, it could be everything from literacy, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Renaissance humanism, the First and Second Great Awakenings, the rise of nationalism, the reform movements of the 19th century, women's suffrage, temperance, the progressive era, right? The rise of human rights, the experience of 2 monster world wars. All of these have combined to do something, to create a story out there of a change in empathy. When the slave world in the Middle Passage of the 16th and 17th century is unthinkable to our modern minds. And it's important that we look at the past and analyze it and appreciate this change in empathy so that we, as actors in our own history, can project that empathy and expand that empathy into the future. Thank you. That's where the lecture ends today.